With Chapter 18, we go into another type of report, which is a recommendation report. And this is when you are reporting on a potential for a course of action or reparation of a situation, and you need to make a recommendation. It could be as simple as recommending a different way of doing something, or recommending a person for being hired, or anything else. So let's take a look at what this actually means. We need to look at recommendation reports in terms of the role they play in technical communication and in business and how we use them, and then a problem-solving model for developing them. How we see, because we're recommending something, we understand that maybe there's something we can make better, right? So we have a problem and a solution. Now, the word problem may not be an exactly perfect word because the way things are now may not actually be a problem, but you just have a recommendation for how to make it better. But it's kind of like in writing where you have, a thesis or a problem statement. It's the same basic concept. And then we'll get into the actual writing of the plan. So we have 4 kinds of questions the average recommendation report wants to answer or needs to answer. First is, what should we do about the certain problem? Or should we do things a little differently? Should we use this or this to do this, right? Or we currently do this to do this. Should we be doing this instead to do this? I know it's kind of vague and kind of odd sounding, but it's exactly how we approach it. So we'll look at it in terms of what we can do to make this work. Within recommendation reports, you have this idea of feasibility, and those types of reports are going to answer 3 questions. They're going to answer questions of possibility, economic wisdom, and perception. And what feasibility is just like the degree at which this option is a good idea, like how will it help? You need to answer these questions to help people come to a determination about your recommendation. So by using the problem-solving method, you're going to figure out the best way to present information. You're going to start by identifying whatever the problem or opportunity is. So you have an idea for a new way of doing something. Okay, so this is how you're going to identify the issue. You're going to establish any sort of criteria for responding to this problem. So what are you going to base your information on is your first kind of real good idea as you're getting into the writing. Then you're going to look at any options. You're going to study each option based on the criteria you established and make conclusions about them. And then you're going to formulate recommendations. Your solution for fixing the problem may not be the only way. There could be multiple ways, but you have to make the recommendation as to why the one you're selecting, the one you're suggesting is the best option. You're going to do this with the logic boxes. And so logic boxes really help you sort of lay this out in a visual way. And to some extent, I like the idea of logic boxes in a recommendation report because it really helps to make it clear for the reader exactly what the options are. So first logic box is the problem. Should we repair or replace our copier? So we don't know if we're going to repair it. We don't know if we're going to replace it. So now we know we have 2 potential courses of action, repairing it, replacing it. And now we're going to look at each one in terms of the benefits. Like, how does it benefit us to repair it? How does it benefit us to replace it? What sort of options do we get with both of these? And then it helps us to come to a decision. So based on this route of information, we end up learning that copier B is the excellent choice. And so we decide, first off, we're not going to repair it because it just doesn't really work in the long term. It's just going to break again. We can get some new options with a newer machine. So now we are going to decide to replace it. Now we're going to decide, okay, are we going to go black and white? Or are we going to have black and white and color? And then we look at color. We say, color, you know what? It's expensive. People take advantage of it. We just don't use it that often. Probably not a good idea. Black and white is great. And then now we need to figure out our other needs. And then we rank our options, each one. You can also do a matrix to do the exact same thing, but can you see it's a little bit harder to follow? Matrices are good for presenting numbers. In the case of this one, the number of pages per minute, whether or not the copier can do the duplexing, which is the 2-sided, whether or not it does color, and then basing it on a score. So the weight there, remember, has to do with the criteria. So the number of pages it can do per minute gets a weight of 1, the duplexing gets a weight of 3, and the color gets a weighting of 4. And then you can do the math across. I do like the logic boxes for decision making, but then for providing detailed information and rationale as to why you came to those decisions, a matrix works rather well. You do want to make sure you're explaining your decision matrix so your reader understands why you chose certain criteria and why you didn't choose other ones, especially if they might have expected part of it. Now, the decision matrix, if you relied on the logic boxes, the first major logic box was, we are not repairing. So then it helps the reader to understand this decision matrix has no aspect of reparation in it. It is moreover for buying a new copier. You want to make sure you explain the weights you assigned and why they have the weights, and then the ratings you assigned and why. So the decision matrix, just like this, isn't really going to stand by itself. You're going to have a narrative along with it explaining not only the weights, 1, 2, 1, 3, and 4 over there, but also the scores you gave for each one of the copiers that you reviewed. When it comes time to present the conclusion, you're going to rank all of the options. So all of the options you came up with, including the good ones, are going to be in the conclusion, but then you're going to classify them. And so this helps to draw the conclusion toward the recommendation you are making. And then you're going to present a compound conclusion where you give options for the reader, as well as detailed information about the correct course of action. Overall recommendation reports have 3 sections: front matter, body, and back matter. Should sound a little bit familiar, right? Because we've seen this before. Within the body itself, we're going to have an introduction, the methods. So the introduction sets the stage. It shows the problem or the opportunity. It gives a preview of the information. Methods is the way you studied information in order to draw the conclusions you're recommending. Results is what you figured out in order to make your recommendation, the conclusions you determined, and then the recommendations themselves. This is kind of the same project, those logic boxes put forward, right? Because it goes through this. It starts with the problem, and then the things you're looking to evaluate on, the recommendations you make, and the conclusions you've got. It all goes together. With the introduction, you're going to answer 9 questions. This is a lot to put in an introduction. And so this is not going to be a single paragraph introduction. It's going to be multiple paragraphs. So subject, purpose, and background of the report. You're going to set the stage for the reader so they have an excellent idea of what it is you're talking about. Then you're going to list your sources of information so the reader is clear about what information you looked at and reviewed and researched in order to draw these conclusions. What sort of scope the report has. So what does the report include and what does it not include? Scope is an important aspect of it because sometimes you're talking about reviewing or redoing one aspect of an overall process. And so the scope helps the reader to understand, like, what kind of a box are you putting everything in? Then what are your most significant findings and your recommendations? How is the report organized so the reader knows how to move through it? And then you're going to define those key terms. We saw the same thing with the proposals, right? Because you need to define those key terms and you need to help the reader understand exactly what the report is going to do and how it's going to guide them down and through the information. In the body, you're going to have 4 major questions. What did you do with your methods? What did you see or determine, which is your results? What do those results mean, which is your conclusion? And then what are you recommending? This is the process you go through to make a recommendation. There's 4 important factors here when it comes to how you present this. The first is the content. The content must be exhaustive. It must have everything in there the reader could potentially need to know in order to make a proper decision. Your tone is important. Now, this has to do with being, optimistic and energetic, maybe even a little concerned about whatever the problem is you're trying to fix. But you need to convey self-assuredness and authority and confidence in your decisions. The form is essential. This is what this report looks like. Depending on who's getting it, it could be like a formal report with a cover page, or it could be a memo. Memos can be long too. So you want to make sure the form is where it needs to be to respect the reader. And then location. This is where you make your recommendation. Do you need to come out with, boom, here's my recommendation and here's why? Or do you need to kind of paint the picture and fill in the clouds and draw the trees and then recommendation? The audience analysis and understanding who's going to read this kind of determines that second one. The front matter itself has several elements. This is for an overall recommendation report that is going to be more formal, is not in memo format. A letter of transmittal is kind of like a cover letter almost. It says what the report's about, who it's to, who it's from, and has that vital information. Then you have the official cover and an official title page, and these are two different things. They are distinct from each other. An abstract provides an overall summary. A table of contents shows where each kind of piece of information is listed and on what page. A list of illustrations, if there are any, provides a list so the reader can say on page 23, there's an illustration of this. And then an executive summary, which is far different from an abstract. It's much more in-depth, provides a greater level of detail, but still summarizes the overall report. With the abstract, we're going to talk about two different kinds here. So a descriptive abstract actually describes the kind of information in the report. An informative abstract says, here's what I found. So these have two different purposes. Can you see how one would go with the report that says, boom, here's my recommendation and here's why. And the other one goes with painting the picture and then here's my recommendation. It's kind of leading them in, doing that sort of persuasion to get the reader on your side before you give the information. Knowing who your audience is dictates which one of these you're going to use. For the executive summary, you're going to have some guidelines to cover. Make sure you cover the evidence that you have as far as the background for the reason for your recommendation, and you're going to describe it very specifically. Executive summaries are kind of like introductions where the reader will look at it to try to get an idea of what it is you're proposing and why. And then they might go back and read the greater report later. Sometimes you hand someone one of these, they flip to the executive summary, they read it while you're standing there. They may ask you a question. They're like, okay, thank you. I will read the rest of the report. Any methods are going to be de-emphasized. So you're going to mention them briefly because what's more important here is how you came to your conclusion and what your conclusion is. So then you're going to describe your findings according to what you think the reader needs so that you can meet their needs for the information and what you think they're interested in. And then if necessary, have someone read your draft to make sure it makes sense in a very high level, overall umbrella sort of way. The back matter gets a few elements here, a glossary and list of symbols. The glossary is important if you've used technical terminology or jargon you couldn't simply avoid. While you might define some of those key terms at the front, you're going to have a full-on glossary at the back. References is what you use to do your research and gather your information. And then appendices is anything you need to attach to the report. It's typically visuals or charts or things of this nature, okay? A recommendation report can be huge. It's different than a proposal because a proposal proposes a course of action, whereas a recommendation report recommends one. I've written recommendation reports in response to the proposals I received from an RFP. If that makes sense. So I issued an RFP, I got proposals back, and then I wrote a recommendation report for which one of those potential customer or potential providers was going to let us be their customer. This is kind of the bureaucratic side of things sometimes, but it is also quite helpful because it helps you to organize information and really sort of better understand exactly why you're making the recommendation you do. So with writing recommendation reports, remember, this is where you have a problem or an opportunity and you have come up with your brain a course of action and you need to propose it to somebody so that they follow your plans. It is different than a normal proposal because with this one, you are recommending a final course of work and you're using your document to show why it's the best option. Recommendation reports are incredibly valuable as both internal and external documents, but the form they take and the content they include is different depending on who you're sending it to. So as with everything else we do, an audience analysis is an absolutely essential part of the process. See you on the next one.